decades, historians pointed to one man as the architect of Khrushchev's removal. They were wrong. The real answer was buried inside two versions of the same document, an official transcript and a verbatim record of the same meeting that don't describe the same event. Someone rewrote history. The question is who? And more importantly, why October 16, 1964? Soviet citizens picked up their morning newspapers and read a short announcement. Nikita Khrushchev, the man who had run the Soviet Union for over a decade, had stepped down. The reason given was simple: age, health. Leonid Brezhnev was named his successor the same day. That was the official story. What no Soviet citizen was told was that Khrushchev hadn't chosen anything. He had been on vacation at his Black Sea dacha 4 days earlier when the phone rang. A colleague called to say his presence was needed in Moscow. Agricultural policy needed attention. Come back early. He got on the plane. When it landed, the wrong car was waiting, wrong driver, wrong faces standing around the tarmac. And standing among them was the one man whose entire job was to protect Khrushchev from exactly this kind of situation. He didn't say a word. Khrushchev was taken directly to a meeting that had already been running without him. The verdict had already been decided. The votes were already counted. What followed over the next 2 days wasn't a debate. It was a sentencing. By October 14th, it was over. He lost both titles simultaneously. First Secretary and Chairman of the Council of Ministers. Gone in a single session. That evening his portrait came down from the Hotel Moskva. The newspapers called it a retirement. Now here is what makes this story different from every other political removal in Soviet history. In 1957, when a group of Presidium members tried to push Khrushchev out the first time, he survived. He outmaneuvered them. He appealed to the full Central Committee, got his allies flown into Moscow, and turned the vote around completely. The men who moved against him that time were the ones who ended up losing everything. The people planning the 1964 removal knew that story better than anyone. They had watched it happen. Some of them had been in the room. So this time, they did something different. They didn't just plan a vote. They planned for every move Khrushchev might make to survive it. They covered every exit. And then they forged the records afterward to make it look like something it wasn't. Which brings us back to those two transcripts. The official published version of the October 14th Central Committee meeting describes a room that reached spontaneous consensus. No open debate, because participants simply agreed. Brezhnev's nomination described as a natural result of the moment. The verbatim stenographic record, the one taken live in the room as it happened, tells a completely different story. Someone changed it, and that someone had to be powerful enough to rewrite the official record of a Central Committee plenum and make it stick. So, who was it? And how far back does this actually go? To understand who removed Khrushchev, you first have to understand why nobody stopped them. In 1956, Khrushchev stood in front of over 1,000 party delegates and did something no Soviet leader had ever done. He told the truth about Stalin, the purges, the murders, the paranoia. He named it directly. People in the room reportedly wept, some fainted. He freed political prisoners. He allowed writers to publish work that would have gotten them killed 5 years earlier. For a brief window in the late 1950s, the Soviet Union had something it hadn't experienced in a generation: the sense that things might actually get better. By 1962, that window had closed. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended with Soviet missiles leaving Cuba on American terms, American inspections of Soviet ships. Khrushchev's own colleagues documented it in writing afterward. The USSR had accepted every condition the United States set. On the world stage, it looked like complete retreat. Inside the Kremlin, the men around Khrushchev took note. Then came the agricultural disaster. The Virgin Land Scheme was Khrushchev's signature project. A decade of work. The idea was simple: cultivate the unused land across Kazakhstan and Siberia and make the Soviet Union self-sufficient in grain production. The country that was going to bury capitalism would feed itself without help from anyone. By 1964, the Soviet Union was buying grain from the United States and Canada. That single fact echoed through every Kremlin corridor. The country that had promised to outproduce the West was importing food from the West. It was not just a policy failure. It was an ideological embarrassment that had no clean explanation. But here is what actually pushed his colleagues over the edge. It wasn't the foreign policy. It wasn't even the grain. It was the way Khrushchev had started behaving inside the system itself. He split the entire party structure into separate industrial and agricultural wings without consulting anyone. Career paths that took men decades to build were wiped out overnight. He humiliated colleagues in open meetings, cutting them off, dismissing their positions in front of others. And in the summer of 1964, word started moving through the upper levels of the party that Khrushchev was planning a full reshuffle of the presidium after his vacation. The men already planning his removal heard that and moved faster. There is something worth noting here. The people who removed Khrushchev were not reformers. They were not pushing for change. They were men whose careers, whose power bases, whose entire positions inside the Soviet system depended on things staying exactly as they were. Khrushchev had become unpredictable, and unpredictable, inside a system built entirely on control, is the most dangerous thing a leader can be. So they decided to control him. The question is, who exactly made that decision first? Because the answer is not the one most historians assumed for decades. There wasn't one plan. There were two, and for a while neither group knew the other existed. The first group centered on Leonid Brezhnev. On paper, he was the second most powerful figure in the party. Secretary of the Central Committee, a loyal Khrushchev ally for years. The kind of man who smiled in every photograph and offended nobody. That was exactly what made him dangerous. From roughly April 1964, Brezhnev began running a quiet operation out of Zavidovo, his hunting lodge outside Moscow. Not from his office, not through official channels. From a hunting lodge. Phone calls were made in person. Meetings happened without agendas. He sent party workers out to the regions to test sentiment among Central Committee members. He told them to frame every conversation as support for Khrushchev's policies. Not opposition. He wanted information. He didn't want a trail. The second group was built around two men, Alexander Shelepin and Vladimir Semikasny. Shelepin had run the KGB from 1958 to 1961, then moved to chair the Party State Control Committee, a body with oversight powers across the party, the government, and the military. Semikasny was running the KGB now. He was Shelepin's protege going back to their days leading the Komsomol, the Soviet youth organization. These two hadn't concluded that Khrushchev was simply failing. They had concluded he was dismantling the structures they had spent their entire careers building inside. Brezhnev had the party network. Shelepin and Semikasny had the security services. At some point in the summer of 1964, these two operations found each other. Exactly when and how that first conversation happened is still not fully documented. What is documented is what came next. They had two more problems to solve. The first was the military. Marshal Malinovsky, the defense minister, had to keep the army completely out of it. In 1957, Khrushchev had survived his first removal attempt, partly because Marshal Zhukov had physically flown his supporters into Moscow to secure the Central Committee vote. That could not happen again. Malinovsky had to be brought in or neutralized. The second problem was Mikhail Suslov, the party's chief ideologist, the man whose presence inside any political move gave it legitimacy. Without Suslov, the removal was just a crime. With him, it was a party decision. When Suslov was told what they were planning, a witness said his lips turned blue. He said, "What are you talking about? There will be a civil war." Then he joined. Every exit was covered. Every role was assigned. The only thing left was the man himself, and he had no idea any of it was coming. Which is the most important part of this entire story. Vladimir Semikasny was 37 years old when he became head of the KGB. Khrushchev had personally put him in that job, trusted him, promoted him over men with more experience and longer records. And Semikasny's specific responsibility, the one written into the structure of his organization, was to protect Soviet leadership. The KGB's 9th Directorate existed for exactly that purpose. Every meeting Khrushchev attended was monitored, every phone call logged, every movement tracked. If someone was building a case against Khrushchev, If someone was making calls they shouldn't be making, if someone was meeting people in hunting lodges outside Moscow without leaving a paper trail, Semychastny's organization was supposed to find it and report it directly to Khrushchev. Semychastny knew exactly what Brezhnev was doing at Zavidovo. He knew because he was part of it. Every morning, Semychastny personally curated the intelligence file placed on Khrushchev's desk. He selected what Khrushchev read about the world. He selected what Khrushchev didn't read. For months, while the operation was being built around him, Khrushchev sat at his desk reading a version of reality that had been carefully edited by the man running the plot against him. One phone call. That's all it would have taken. One call from Semychastny to Khrushchev, and the entire operation collapses. Khrushchev had survived a Presidium majority before. He knew how to fight inside the system. The plotters knew this too. Getting the KGB wasn't a tactical advantage. It was the whole foundation. According to Semychastny's own memoirs, Brezhnev at one point raised the question of whether Khrushchev should simply be killed, removed permanently. No trial, no retirement, no loose ends. Semychastny refused. That was the one line he wouldn't cross. Whatever his reasons, whatever calculation he made in that moment, he said no. And because he said no, the coup stayed bloodless. Not because the men running it chose peace. Because the man responsible for carrying it out drew a line and held it. That detail matters. Because it tells you something about how this operation actually worked. This wasn't a group of true believers acting on principle. These were men making cold calculations about what they could get away with and what they couldn't. Killing Khrushchev crossed a line that even they recognized. But removing him, humiliating him, erasing him from Soviet history while he was still alive, that was apparently fine. And the man they trusted to protect him was the one who made it possible. Now here is where it gets even more calculated. Because bringing Suslov in, keeping the army out, and flipping the KGB chief were all essential. But none of it meant anything without one final move. They had to get Khrushchev back to Moscow without him knowing why. October 12, 1964. Khrushchev is at his Black Sea dacha, vacation. He had spent the morning meeting with a foreign diplomat, then spoken by phone with the crew of the Voskhod spacecraft, which had launched 2 days earlier. He congratulated them personally. By every visible measure, he was a man with no reason to worry. That afternoon, the phone rang. Mikhail Suslov was calling from Moscow. Agricultural policy needed attention. Nothing urgent, but his presence would help move things along. Could he come back a few days early? Khrushchev agreed. What he didn't know was that the Presidium had already voted that same day in Moscow to remove him. The decision wasn't pending. It was done. The men were in position. The speeches were written. The votes were counted. All they needed was for him to get on the plane. He got on the plane. When it landed in Moscow, the wrong car was waiting. Wrong driver, unfamiliar faces around the tarmac, and Semychastny standing there in person. The head of the KGB, whose job was to protect him, present at the airport to meet a man returning from vacation. That's not normal. That's never normal. Khrushchev was taken directly to a Presidium session that had been running without him. The room was full, every seat occupied. Nobody looked surprised to see him. Nobody looked uncomfortable. They had been waiting. Suslov opened the session and read out a prepared indictment on behalf of the entire Presidium and Secretariat. Every accusation had been signed off in advance. Then Shelepin stood and argued that Khrushchev's leadership, taken as a whole, had worked against the interests of the Soviet people. Then came Polyansky's report. 50 pages. Foreign policy failures. The Cuban retreat. 128 ceremonial lunches and receptions in a single year at party expense. And the one that landed hardest. While Khrushchev had spent years accusing Stalin of building a personality cult, his own portrait had appeared in Pravda 147 times in a single year. Stalin's portrait had appeared in that same publication 6 times across its entire history. The room was silent. Khrushchev's son-in-law was present and wrote about it later. He described Khrushchev sitting slumped in his chair, head down, not raising his eyes, looking very small, as if the force had suddenly left his body. One person spoke up for him. Anastas Mikoyan, an old ally, suggested Khrushchev might stay on in some reduced capacity. He was overruled immediately. Khrushchev pushed back. He admitted some of the criticism was fair. But the votes weren't there. The army was staying out. The KGB was sitting across the table from him. And there was no Central Committee rescue coming this time. Because Brezhnev's people had already spent 6 months working those same Central Committee members first. On October 14th, the Central Committee confirmed it. Both titles, gone simultaneously that evening, his portrait came down across Moscow. But the story wasn't over, because what happened next is the part that changes everything. When Russian archivists got access to the original Soviet records decades later, they found something that had never been made public. 2 transcripts of the October 14th Central Committee plenum existed in the archives. Not 1, 2. The first was the official published version, the record the Soviet state had put out for history. The second was the verbatim stenographic transcript, taken live in the room as the meeting happened, word for word, in real time. They don't describe the same meeting. In the official version, no open debate was held because participants spontaneously agreed against it. The room simply reached consensus on its own. Brezhnev's nomination as first secretary is described as a natural result of the moment, emerging organically from the collective will of the Central Committee. In the raw transcript, Brezhnev told them not to debate. He issued the instruction himself directly, at the start of the session. The spontaneous consensus was written in afterward, and his nomination didn't emerge organically from anything. He was nominated immediately, right at the opening, exactly on cue, by people who had clearly been told what to say and when to say it. The spontaneity was added later, by someone with access to the official record and the authority to change it. Khrushchev's silence is explained in the official version as his own choice, a dignified decision to accept the verdict of his colleagues. The verbatim record shows that's not what happened. They ran the coup, then they rewrote the minutes. Now sit with that for a moment. This was a closed session. No foreign press, no outside observers, no political opposition waiting to use the information against them. In a country where the state controlled every word printed, every broadcast transmitted, every document filed, these men still felt the need to go back and change the written record of what happened in that room. They needed it to look like something other than what it was, even in a room where no outside scrutiny was ever coming. That tells you something about the men involved. They understood that power, real lasting power, isn't just about what you do. It's about what the record says you did. History isn't written by the victors. It's rewritten by them, carefully, deliberately, word by word. Yuri Andropov, who would later run the KGB and eventually lead the Soviet Union himself, was asked why nobody at the plenum had spoken up for Khrushchev. His answer was simple. Did you not count how many members of the plenum had been appointed during the Khrushchev era? They owed him everything, and not one of them said a word. Which brings us to the question the official record was specifically designed to prevent anyone from asking. Who actually put Brezhnev in power? And what did he do to them once he got there? For decades, Western analysts pointed to Mikhail Suslov as the man behind the removal. It made sense on the surface. Suslov was the Grey Cardinal, the permanent fixture inside every Soviet power struggle going back to Stalin. His name was on the official record as the man who opened the October 14th plenum and read out the indictment. Without his sanction, the move had no legitimacy. He was the most obvious answer. He was also the wrong one. The memoirs and party records that became available after 1991 tell a more complicated story. Suslov gave the operation legitimacy. Malinovsky kept the army out. Shelepin and Semikasny provided the security apparatus, and at the critical moment, the nerve to go through with it. Ukrainian party chief Petro Shelist, who was inside these events, named Brezhnev and Podgorny as the true driving force. But Semikasny's own memoirs contain a detail that stops everything. We literally had to drag the trembling Brezhnev to the telephone. The man who spent 6 months building the network, mapping the Central Committee, running quiet operations from a hunting lodge outside Moscow, froze when the moment came. The men around him pushed him through it. Shelepin and Semikasny did what Brezhnev couldn't do alone: take any single one of them out of the picture. The plan doesn't survive, which is exactly why, once it worked, Brezhnev spent the following year removing every single one of them. December 1965, Shelepin was stripped of his chairmanship. The Party State Control Committee, the power base he had spent years constructing, was dissolved. He kept his seat on the Politburo, but the machinery was gone. May 1967, Brezhnev used the defection of Stalin's daughter to the United States as the pretext, a KGB failure. Semychastny was fired and transferred to a deputy position in the Ukrainian government. No power, no return. 2 months later, Shelepin was moved to chair the All-Union Trade Union Council. No security role, no political leverage, no path back to anything that mattered. The men who made Brezhnev possible were gone. One by one, quietly, completely, Brezhnev ran the Soviet Union for 18 years after that, second only to Stalin in length of rule. No meaningful reform, no structural change. A slow, managed decline that went unaddressed for nearly 2 decades because addressing it would have required someone willing to disrupt the system. And Brezhnev had not come to power to disrupt anything. He had come to power to hold it. As for Khrushchev, he spent his final 7 years as a supervised private citizen. He dictated his memoirs in secret. The tapes were smuggled to the West and published while he was still alive. He died on September 11, 1971. Pravda acknowledged it in a single line. Private pensioner, no title, no legacy, no reference to what he had done or what had been done to him. Just 2 words. Someone asked him before he died why he hadn't fought harder, why he had accepted the verdict instead of trying to reach his allies and push back. He said, "I am glad that finally the party has matured and can control any individual. Make of that what you will." Because here is the thing about that answer. Either Khrushchev genuinely believed it, in which case the system had broken something in him that couldn't be put back, or he knew exactly what he was saying and chose those words deliberately, leaving behind the only kind of statement a man in his position could make without disappearing entirely. Either way, the men who removed him got exactly what they wanted. A silence so complete that for decades, the world looked at the wrong man and called him the architect. The real story was sitting in a hunting lodge outside Moscow, in a phone call nobody was supposed to trace, in a transcript that got rewritten before anyone outside that room ever saw it, and in the one man who could have stopped all of it with a single phone call, who didn't make it. There is one detail that never made it into the official record. Not the forged version, not even the verbatim transcript. In the months after Brezhnev took power, as Shelepin was being removed and Semychastny was being shipped to Ukraine, someone inside the Kremlin began quietly compiling a separate file. Not an official document, a private record, names, dates, conversations. The kind of thing you keep not because you plan to use it, but because you need to know it exists. Who compiled it has never been confirmed. What was in it has never been fully disclosed, but the file existed. Multiple sources from the post-1991 archive releases reference it without naming it directly. A record of who knew what, who said what, and who made which call in the weeks before October 14, 1964. Brezhnev ruled for 18 years, and that file was never used publicly. The question is whether it was used privately, and whether the men who got removed knew it was out there.